In a vehicle, we have pressures all over. It doesn't matter whether we're talking engine performance and something as what we consider basic as vacuum, or if we're talking about an electric vehicle and we talk about pressures inside a battery pack. We have pressures all over. In fact, a lot of things that happen in a vehicle happen because of pressure differential, higher pressure on one side, a lower pressure on the other. We take advantage of that a lot to make things happen in cars and trucks. One of the first things we're going to talk about here in EP is something we term vacuum. Now that term is actually kind of a misnomer. What we actually mean is pressure lower than atmosphere. Okay? Right now, if you're within the Portland area, or sea level roughly, you're being pushed down on by about 14.7 psi, or about 14.7 pounds per square inch of pressure. Now, our internal combustion engine, because of the way it works, actually creates a pressure lower than atmosphere. We typically term that as vacuum. It's not truly accurate, but it is industry standard. In real time, this engine will drop pressure down to a low of 3 to 4 psi. Not a true vacuum. However, when the atmosphere is pushing down at 14.7 and there's only 3 psi or 4 psi in here, that's a heck of a pressure differential and something that we're going to term vacuum. So anytime in here you hear vacuum, all we're simply stating is a pressure lower than whatever the present atmospheric pressure is. If you happen to move to Denver, Colorado, then atmospheric pressure is not the same as Portland. It's quite a bit lower. So when we talk about engine vacuum in Denver, Colorado, it's still pressure less than atmosphere. It's just offset a bit from what it would be here in Portland. Right? So we're going to keep going here and talk about how this vacuum is created inside an internal combustion engine. How the engine creates this mystical vacuum thing are low pressure area, to be technically correct, or lower than atmospheric pressure. Okay? So as the engine rotates, we'll go through our 4 strokes real quick here. Of course, we're coming down on intake. Here's our intake valve. This is the intake manifold passage. Okay, we're coming down on intake. The intake valve is closed. The exhaust valve back here is closed. So we're coming up on compression. Valve stay closed. We're coming down on the power stroke. And we're just about to pop. And now we're coming up on the exhaust stroke. The exhaust valve back here is opening up to put the spent gases out. Back up again. So now we're going to start back down on the intake stroke. This is really where our low pressure area comes from. We have our piston inside our cylinder. Remember, we have our piston rings on here sealing the piston to the cylinder walls. So that's going to create, essentially, as this piston drops down, since it's sealed around here, it's going to be pulling in. So as it pulls in, we have an intake valve that pops open. So it's going to allow us to pull air through this intake passage coming into the cylinder. Right now the exhaust valve back here is closed, so we're not getting any action back there. We're drawing air past here as we come down. Now it's sealed and the piston's coming back up, so our vacuum is all gone now. However, where we actually measure vacuum, we don't measure vacuum in here. That's difficult to do. That requires special tools. We measure vacuum in the intake manifold. To do that, there are ports somewhere in that intake manifold that tie in that are going to be between our valve here and a part called the throttle plate. Okay? So we're going to measure between that valve and the throttle plate. Okay? As long as the throttle plate is closed, our throttle plate is right over here. This is our throttle plate. This is on one side, the valves past this. If this is closed, and we have our closed valve right here, that means that when that piston was coming down, that low pressure area that it pulled in through here is now trapped inside here. And unless we're working with the 1-cylinder engine, we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 other cylinders right now that are going through their motions, and they're also creating a low pressure area in here. That's where we end up with manifold vacuum. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is manifold vacuum, and that's what's actually trapped inside this intake manifold. Again, to create that, we need that piston going down. The valve's going to be open, drawing into that low pressure area, creating that low pressure area. And as long as we have a closed throttle plate, that is going to create that low pressure area, or lower than atmospheric pressure, inside the intake manifold. Hence, manifold vacuum. All created, I'm going to go backwards for a second here. By the way, don't ever turn an engine over backwards if you can help it. It's a bad idea. You can potentially skip a timing chain. Now, engine, pistons coming down. Came up on exhaust. We're coming down on the intake stroke now. Valve is open. Rings are sealing to the cylinder wall. We're pulling. We have this empty area in here. So as the piston drops down, that area is expanding. It's trying to pull through here, but it's trying to pull against our closed intake valve, closed throttle plate. So that creates that low pressure area, not only in here, but inside the intake manifold as well. The other kind of vacuum that we can have is a ported or timed vacuum, and that's actually created over here around our throttle body. We'll often have a port right around the throttle plate, and we'll have very little vacuum there at all, typically none, until we open the throttle, and then we get a Venturi effect going past that throttle plate where we have a differential in airflow. As that Venturi effect goes past the little orifice that'll be in there, that's going to create a different kind of low pressure area due to the Venturi effect, and we will come up with a ported or timed vacuum. That was much more important on older engines, specifically carbureted engines and very early fuel injected. We don't really use ported vacuum anymore, so it's going to be pretty rare you'll find one of those ports on an engine. A lot of modern engines, we don't see as much vacuum anyway, so we don't use it as often, so you'll see less and less vacuum ports on an engine. But as far as the creation of it, it really gets created inside the cylinder. We end up with manifold vacuum, all thanks to our throttle plate. Let's take a minute and look at our standard vacuum gauge. On this gauge, we have several layers. We have inches of mercury, we have pounds per square inch, or PSI, and we also have kilopascals, or kPa, all on the same gauge. No matter what, if the engine is off and we're not measuring anything at all, or we're at atmosphere, it's going to measure 0. If it's measuring a pressure lower than atmosphere, it's going to go in the upper zone, the inches of mercury. If it's measuring a pressure greater than atmosphere, it's going to go into the lower half of the gauge, the PSI. Notice that kPa is on both of them. Taking a look at our vacuum gauge in operation, you'll see right now we're idle. We're going to come off idle in just a second, but right around idle, you're going to see most engines run between about 17 and 21 inches of mercury. That's going to be a pretty normal vacuum for a good running stock engine. Now, if we take this engine and we hit wide open throttle, we're going to freeze it here just a second. Wide open throttle. All right, forgive our gauge there. It's a little tweaked, but wide open throttle, we're going to come to 0. We're not actually making a positive pressure, but it's going to be to 0. There's no restriction at the throttle plate anymore. Now let's get this running again. Wrap it up a couple of times, and we're going to let it return to idle. Let's smooth out, and I'm just about to create a misfire. Watch what happens to the needle. Now you see the gauge start to shake, the needle drops as we lose efficiency from the misfire. This is a modern computer-controlled engine, so it's not going to respond like an old carbureted engine would to a misfire. You'd see the gauge bounce much more or fluctuate a lot more in that case. Okay, next I've blocked off the intake manifold. See the vacuum go up? We attain a higher level of vacuum because now we have a restriction, additional restriction, in addition to the throttle plate, which caused the vacuum to actually increase or us to go to a lower pressure. Now, I've pulled that back off the intake, and we're going to now cap the exhaust. Okay, watch the gauge. Now we're actually going to drop. We're going to get closer to atmospheric pressure. I can't hold this on there tight enough to fully block it, otherwise it would have gone even lower. So our takeaway here needs to be anything that affects how this engine runs, RPM, throttle, any restriction, anything having to do with airflow is going to have an effect on vacuum as well. So here we've put the two together. Now we've got the vacuum gauge sitting right on top of a throttle plate. Just take a second and watch the gauge in relation to the throttle plate. What happens when the plate's closed and what happens when we snap it open. Notice the direct correlation between the two. Okay, a couple more things about pressures. Well, and related to vacuum, but really, hopefully what you're getting now is all a vacuum is an absence of pressure or a lower than atmospheric pressure. So here in Portland, Oregon, lovely Portland at sea level, roughly, we're looking at about 14.7 pounds per square inch of atmosphere pushing down on us at all times. If we live in Denver, Colorado, however, as it sits at 5,280 feet above sea level, we only have 12 psi of atmospheric pressure pushing down on us. So as we go up in altitude, atmospheric pressure decreases. If you were to happen to live in La Rinconada, Peru, at 16,718 feet above sea level, you'd find the atmospheric pressure drops to only 7.6 psi. On the flip side, if you lived in one of the lowest cities in the world, Jericho and the Palestinian Authority, you'd find yourself at 846 feet below sea level, and you'd now have 15.2 psi of atmospheric pressure pushing down on you. So why is this important? Well, can you drive a car around Jericho? Yes, you can. Can you drive a car around La Rinconada? Yes, you can. So if we're looking at our pressures and some conversions here, you'll notice 14.7 pounds per square inch, or atmospheric pressure at sea level, is equal to 1 bar, which is also 1 atmosphere, which we also know as 101 kilopascals. This just depends on whether we're going to be looking at it in the English system or the metric system as to how we're going to measure this. Okay, so if we had a good running engine and we measured 21 inches of mercury, or inches Hg there. So if we had 21 inches of mercury, if we converted that, we could also call that 9 inches of mercury, 4.4 pounds per square inch, 0.3 bar, or 30.4 kilopascals. Hopefully you just picked up on that last line. How could I be both 21 inches of mercury and 9 inches of mercury at the same time? Well, just to throw this out there, 14.7 pounds per square inch at sea level can be equal to both 0 inches of mercury and 30 inches of mercury. Just like I had, 21 inches of mercury also equals 9 inches of mercury. How does this happen? Because we have two kinds of pressures, that's how. We have an absolute pressure, pressure starting from 0, which we can also term a perfect vacuum. And we can have gauge pressure. That's going to be our pressure related to and compensated for atmospheric pressure. Absolute pressure, an example. If we had no boost at sea level, our pressure would read 14.7 psi. We can throw a little a behind that psi so we know that we're talking about absolute. That also means that on the same gauge in Denver, Colorado, we should see 12 psi, absolute. We are looking at our pressure related to a perfect vacuum or true zero. That's absolute. Once we go to gauge pressure, now gauge pressure, we're going to reference atmospheric pressure. So when we're looking at a gauge, if we aren't making any boost at sea level, it's going to read 0. If we drive that car up to Denver, Colorado, and we look at our boost gauge when we're making no boost, it's going to read 0. Same thing, both places. It's referenced to and compensates for the atmospheric pressure. So regardless of where you're at, it's going to read 0 wherever we are if we're not making any boost. Okay, to wrap it up, that low pressure is created in the cylinder when the piston goes down on the intake stroke and the volume of that cylinder is expanding. But remember, it only works if the cylinder is sealed. If our piston rings are failing, if we have burnt valves, if we have holes in the piston, anything that compromises the sealing of that cylinder is going to keep it from creating that low pressure area, aka vacuum. Also remember that manifold vacuum depends on the position of the throttle plate. If we don't have a throttle plate, like most diesels, then the only way we'll actually get a manifold vacuum is if we're trying to move so much air through that intake that it can't all fit and we create a restriction at the inlet point. Most of you know that all smart people have turbo diesels anyway, so we're running under boost most of the time anyhow, so vacuum's not an issue. Something to think about. If a pressure doesn't make sense, if you're looking at something and you're thinking it just there's no way this can be right, stop a minute and think. Are you looking at it absolute pressure or a gauge pressure? Our rule of thumb, at idle, a good running stock passenger vehicle, gas engine with traditional throttle plate and traditional throttle plate controls is going to make 17 to 21 inches of mercury of vacuum at idle at sea level. And any vehicle should be almost 0 inches of mercury at wide open throttle. Because once that throttle goes to wide open, we don't have intake restriction anymore. The only place our low pressure area, vacuum, exists now is inside the cylinder. So once we go to wide open throttle, we should have either a gauge reading of 0 or an absolute reading of whatever the atmospheric pressure is wherever we happen to be. Keep those rules of thumb in mind. So what about performance applications? What if we build a very high performance engine? We put a great big rumpy rump cam in something. Doesn't matter if it's 4 cylinders, 8, 10, 12 cylinders. Once we change the efficiency of an engine, what do you think is going to happen to the vacuum that engine makes? All right, so what did you think about our race car? Should we have more vacuum, i.e. a higher inches of mercury, or lower vacuum, closer to atmospheric pressure in an engine like that? Hopefully by now you figured out that engine, not the most efficient, especially in your idle. That engine's actually going to have a lot lower vacuum or closer to atmospheric pressure, especially around idle. It just isn't going to pull air. It doesn't seal quite the same, even though it makes a lot of horsepower. All right, our key points. A stock engine in good condition at sea level, 17 to 21 inches of mercury. You can see a little bit more than that. Really efficient engine, modern engines, you shouldn't really see much less than this. On a modern engine with normal throttle controls, this would actually be a pretty low number. Remember that 0 inches of mercury is what we want at wide open throttle. very close to it anyway. You may see a very small amount of a vacuum created there, sorry, lower pressure area created there, because we still have some restriction. Even at wide open throttle, the throttle plate still represents a small amount of restriction to airflow. Intake manifold design, throttle body size can still be a small amount of restriction at wide open throttle. You should still be very close to 0 inches of mercury or atmospheric pressure, whatever that may be. Unless, of course, you're cool, in which case you're running forced induction, i.e. turbo or supercharger, and then you're running 10, 15, 20 pounds of boost at wide open throttle. So, you know, not an issue anyway. Different story for that one. Remember that this is actually created by a low pressure area inside the cylinder as the piston is coming down on the intake stroke. It is the high pressure in the atmosphere around us that wants to push into that engine, not the engine pulling it in, but the high pressure in the atmosphere pushing that into the engine, into that lower pressure area. When we talk about pressure, we always have higher pressure wanting to move to an area of lower pressure. I know earlier on I talked about it pulling it in. That's the old technician in me. Realistically, the technologically proper way to say this and the truthful way it works, the high pressure area from the atmosphere around us is pushing into that cylinder. And why do we have this vacuum in the first place? Well, we have restriction. Valves and our throttle plates, passages, whatnot, it represents restriction. If we didn't have any restriction, we wouldn't have an area of lower pressure. Wouldn't happen, but we have restriction, so we do, and we can utilize this to help tell us things about how the engine is operating, what kind of load it's under, some wonderful things like that. So hopefully you've learned a little bit more about vacuum pressure now than you knew before. So take this out, practice a little bit. We'll look at some engines when we get into lab with the vacuum gauge, and you'll get a better feel for this. All right. So we'll see you next video.